Good morning, everybody. I am so happy to see people as they're coming into the room. Please take your virtual seats, and we'll get started in just a few seconds as people are coming in. I hope everybody is happy that it's Friday. Apparently, it's going to be a great day weather-wise this Friday, leading us into a weekend that, as the morning shows shared with me this morning, is going to be a great weekend. So I'm happy to have you all join us this morning for a great conversation to help kick that weekend off. Well, as it is 10:04, I'd like to officially welcome you to Coffee Klatsch with Prevention Action Alliance. For those of you who I haven't yet met, my name is Bobby Persinger, and I'm the Deputy Director of Prevention Action Alliance. And this morning, I am lucky enough to be joined by our Advocacy and Public Policy Liaison, JP Dorval. So if you don't know JP, everybody make sure in the chat box you say hi to him. And I would encourage you to get to know him really well because he is our face at the State House. And hopefully you'll join him on his regular webinars that he does, talking about advocacy and public policy around prevention and the things that preventionists value. So I'm happy to have him join us this morning on the chat. Before we get to it, a couple things. I want to introduce you. You can't see him, but like any good executive producer is, James is on the call with us, and he will be fielding any type of questions that you have in the chat box. So don't hesitate to ask away, and he'll be there to engage with you that way. And he might chime in every now and again if there's something that we need to know. Also, this conversation today is going to be a little different from our previous Klatches. As we all know, and we're all well aware, we are currently in not only in the throes of the COVID experience and learning how to engage with one another from a socially responsible distance and a mask wearing responsibility, but we're also in a civil and a social uprising as it pertains to the health and happiness of human beings across our planet. In your materials section, you should have already received in the reminder emails for this morning's conversation, but if you didn't, there is that material section in the console portion on the side of your screen. There's a couple pieces of information in there that we would like to bring your attention to. Some actual pieces of legislation that are talking about racism as a public health crisis and how to address racism from a policy standpoint. There's also a policy statement crafted by JP that we made about a month ago and put out to all of our networks and our collaborators and our friends. And I would encourage you to not only read those things in the material section, but also consider for your coalitions, your groups, your organizations being that champion and that advocate for maintaining a public statement. I think JP will probably talk about it on our call this morning, but he's even represented us down at the State House, provided testimony. And the reason why we're holding this conversation this morning is because we want to ensure that the state of Ohio and that the prevention world is well aware and comfortable with the idea that cultural competency, diversity and humility is a linchpin to prevention work. And we have to be able to recognize and understand that all folks, regardless of their race or orientation or any other key determining factor that might segregate them from other parts of the population, have full rights and the responsibilities of all of us to be treated humanely, fairly, and with equity. So as we have our conversation this morning, like always, I encourage you all to join us in the discussion in the chat box. Everyone has been muted, but if you would like to share something verbally through audio, just go ahead and raise your hand, and James is our executive producer on this Klatsch. We'll engage with you and we'll open up your microphone so that you can speak. Now that I've got that out of the way, I am excited and happy to have our special guest join us. Our special guest today for the conversation is Kyle Strickland. Kyle is the Senior Legal Analyst and Special Assistant to the Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. In his day-to-day work, Kyle supports the director and the executive leadership team at the Kirwan in developing strategies that increase the policy impact of the Institute and build partnerships and collaborative engagements with community stakeholders. His work primarily focuses on local and national civil rights issues, criminal justice reform, economic justice, and equitable access to education. Additionally, outside of his work with the Kirwan, Kyle is the director of My Brother's Keeper Ohio, which is a statewide network that helps provide educational and community opportunities for youth of color. Kyle is a native of Columbus. He got his bachelor's degree from Ohio State in political science, and then went on to Harvard Law School to obtain a law degree. So we are excited to have Kyle with us today, and I think he's going to help us have a really great conversation. So please join me in welcoming Kyle to the Klatsch. Kyle, to bring you into the conversation, I think one of the questions that should be asked is, what is the origin? What is the impetus, in your opinion, that has led us to this point? What happened that we didn't have this thought decades ago? That treating people fairly and equitably is just now coming on to our consciousness.
Great. Oh, it sounds like I'm getting. Hello?
Yep.
Everybody? Okay, sorry. So, one of the things that I think is important for folks to recognize is that while these issues are now a conversation that we're having all across the country, and this is a national dialogue, this is also something that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time. And I think especially in this moment, we are facing a reckoning, a multiracial reckoning of people saying that we can no longer sit on the sidelines. Like, this has to be a conversation we have to lean into. And I think given the moment we're in with the economic calamity that has been brought on by the health crisis of the pandemic, it has completely upended society, and it has completely changed the way we view the world and the way that we see ourselves. And as a result, what has ended up happening then is folks are realizing that we can't go back to normal, because normal wasn't necessarily a good thing for far too many of our community members. And so there's a lot of trauma, a lot of vulnerability and all that. And so I think people are wrestling with, well, if we are in this new paradigm, if we want to move forward and do better moving forward, it requires us to reckon with these issues. And then, quite frankly, just the facts are that it still is so devastating when you see these instances of violence against Black people in this country time and time again, and then the implications of police violence and what that does is especially additive to. So I think the moment of both the health and economic crisis that we're in, plus the racial justice issue forefront, and then it's a 2020 election year, and you have someone in the White House who is setting the stage for laying blame and trying to divide and stir up all sorts of language that really doesn't get us to our best impulses. And so I think it requires all of us to step up one way or another to have this discussion and conversation.
I think that, thank you for that. That's I'm in agreement with you 100% that this conversation is a global one, regardless of where you live or what looks back at you in the mirror. As preventionists, part of our job is to ensure that communities are happy, healthy, safe, and drug-free. And so we're going out into the state, across the state, trying to provide opportunities for protective factors to reduce harmful behaviors, to address mental illness, to address substance use disorders. And as I mentioned earlier on the call, at the core of our work is this concept that we have to be culturally aware. So, gentlemen, give me your thoughts. How can we, as prevention folks trying to help build healthy communities in today's climate, how can we ensure that we're being culturally aware, educated, informed, and maybe most importantly, humble enough to understand that people are different and that we have to recognize that?
Well, one of the things that I think people have to recognize is that this is a learning moment. This is not something that you can just read a book on or have one or two experiences around and then be done with. I mean, when we're talking about issues of race and of equity and of inclusion and building safe and healthy communities, you can't talk about that by just looking at individual actions and individual behaviors. You also have to look at the structures and the systems that have been set up that disinvest in communities, that don't provide the opportunities and the safety and security for communities in the first place. And so for all of us, we have to realize that no matter how great the work that we do, it may be amazing work, the work that we do, but no matter how great it is, we all have learning to do in this moment. And we got to do more to figure out ways in which we can empathize with others, as well as learn how we can hold ourselves accountable and hold others accountable along with that process. Those are hard conversations to have, but those are conversations we actually need to lean into, because otherwise we're not going to reckon with these issues and we're not going to learn how to do better.
Right. And building off of that, to be culturally competent is to be a lifelong learner. You have to be in the mindset of, I don't know everything. I'm not going to know everything, but I am willing to understand and learn as much as I can. So you can build your cultural competence. It's something that you build over time. It's not something like Kyle said, you read a couple articles and a couple of studies and some data points, and all of a sudden you're culturally competent. So yeah, I mean, you just it's continuous self-reflection and continuous learning for sure.
What would you all say, as again, as preventionists, we like those practical tools. If we're in a meeting, if we're in a coalition meeting, or we're in a local health department conversation, and something is said, what are some things that we could do in that moment to address, hey, wait a second, we have to be cognizant of this issue?
So there's a couple things. So one, it's being prepared, right, in the first place, just so that you can go ahead of any sort of issue. So I'm hearing some audio in the back. Sorry about that. So one of the most important pieces is for us to be prepared and ready for any of those situations that happen in the first place. And so we need to have the. So I'm hearing some audio. I'm not sure if anybody else hears that feedback. All right, I think we're good now. So one of the key pieces that we need to have is to make sure you're able to be an active bystander. The facts are that there are plenty of times when people say something that you find offensive or problematic, and it's really hard to speak up in that moment. I know we've all had those moments where somebody has said something and then we didn't say anything, but after the fact we think, "Wow, I wish I would have said something in this moment," and you know exactly what you would have said. You can run it through your head of like, this is what I would have said differently. One of the things that we have to do is there's a couple things you can just do that are just straightforward, everyday points around having a conversation in the first place of having them repeat if it's not something incredibly offensive, but questioning what they just said and say, did you actually mean that? I want to be clear about that. And then really saying, well, here's where I think that's misguided, and this is why. And then always pivot, if you can, to personal experiences, because your personal experiences, they can try to invalidate whatever statistic or whatever thing you try to throw out to disprove their point, but they can't invalidate your experiences. And your experiences have to say, look, I think that the remark that was made was offensive, and ultimately I think it misses what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to accomplish as a prevention specialist, and that's the equity and safety and security of all people, and they have dignity, and we need to provide that for them. And so there's a lot of different places and spaces. I mean, the Kerwin Institute, where I work, we have trainings and kind of tips on how to be an active bystander, and that's really important because it's hard to have these conversations. They're not easy to have, but we want to make sure that people are prepared and have the toolkit ready to have these conversations. But I will say this though, there's no one size fits all toolkit for this. I mean, this stuff requires one, building trust, but also the courage to speak up. Now, you're not going to be able to speak up in every situation because the dynamics that are at play, but it does require some courage to speak up and have that conversation as we move forward.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. You mentioned something earlier about, obviously this is a systemic issue, that there are different uh, forums within our country that have helped get us to where we're at today. Talk about some of those systemic problems, and maybe if you can, what can we do as preventionists?
So it's great. So this is something that all of us need to play a role in, and this is understanding and recognizing our history and how we got here today. The facts are that the inequality and despair that we see every single day in our country is not the result of individual actions or individual choices or individual behaviors. That does not explain systemic racism. That does not explain generational poverty. That does not explain exploitation of communities. What it is we have a history that from the very beginning enslaved Black people and committed genocide on indigenous people, and through Jim Crow and segregation and redlining and all these laws and practices that were discriminatory have led to where we are today. And so you might not see laws on the books that are racist on its face, but what you find is that the application leads to disparate outcomes because you have discriminatory enforcement. So, for example, well, we can talk about, prevention, but, for example, when it comes to drug use, in cases when you have Black people and white people using drugs at similar rates, you see that Black people are more likely to be arrested, incarcerated, sentenced longer than white people because of discriminatory effects. And here's why this is important. We have to recognize this not in the context of just to say, oh, wow, how bad things have been, but to recognize that if in order to build the type of community that we're all looking for, one that is of equity and of justice for all people and safety and security for all people, we can't ignore the harms and the flaws of the past. Some want to say that, we should just not talk about this history because somehow that's not being patriotic. When in fact, the conversations that I would say is that what it really means to be patriotic is to say that despite all of these flaws, despite all of these problems, we can still be a great country and we can still build towards that more perfect union. Because when we don't acknowledge history, when we just say everything was perfect or, things were bad then, but they have nothing to do with anything now, what you are doing is diminishing the experiences of so many people and who have been marginalized in this society, who have been counted out. And what instead you are doing is saying the problems and the inequality that people have right now, that has to do with their own fault. That is their own behavior. And that messaging is problematic. We need to say, let's focus on how we could build safety, security, and community for you, because communities have been exploited. Communities have been exploited, marginalized, and left behind. And that's not to diminish the hardships or the struggles of anybody else. What it is to say is that it shouldn't be on us to look down on other people because of their circumstance.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. And in the chat box, Dr. Thomas, thank you for joining in on the conversation. Dawn says, we have to acknowledge the historical discrimination and the trauma of the past before we can move forward. And Kyle, I think she's just supplementing your point. And it's interesting to me because, we have folks who are commenting on this time and what we're going through as a nation. And they oftentimes will argue that their heritage or that their experience is being threatened. Now, I have said many times in open forums that I am a product of the American South, and we know that the American South has a long, deep-rooted history with slavery and with the maltreatment of people in our country, and I'm offended when somebody says that having the Confederate flag removed is unfair or unkind. When we're approached by conversations like that or by comments like that, how can we respond? How can white
That's
people
great.
like me respond?
Well, one, I think for you to respond just like that, I think is one example. So here's the thing. At the end of the day, people have started telling this twisted and warped narrative of our country, and they have also and when we talk about the American South, like it's a complicated history, and for people to say that the Confederate flag is quote heritage, not hate, does not recognize the amount of hate that has come from the defending of the Confederacy and the defense of slavery. And if people want to say what we need to recognize and uplift when it comes to the American South and what we have done, and this is all across the country in general, it's recognizing our history of saying, look, you can recognize your history and acknowledge your history without glorifying people who did horrible things to people. The American South shouldn't be represented by Confederates who tried to, basically break from the Union. I mean, the fact that this is even a debate, I mean, that it's ridiculous. I mean, the facts are that you can recognize. I mean, you had, a descendant of Robert E. Lee who said, look, he was a great grandson or something like that. He basically said, look, I can recognize my family's legacy and what contributions they had in American history, but I can also recognize the choices and actions that they made that are a stain on this country. And what we can do to build toward a society of equity is say, wow, there have been mistakes and horrible things that have happened in the past, but our future isn't going to be one that is filled with hate. Our future is going to be one that's filled with love. I mean, look at what even NASCAR is moving towards. They said, look, even if you think your flag represents heritage, not hate, to a lot of people, that flag represents pain and trauma and complete marginalization. And the removal of that flag does not mean that you are removed from society. That's not what this means. What it does mean is that we're not going to glorify those hatred things of the past. What we can do instead is turn on the things that represent equity and justice, that are more than just those bad things about the South. And so, but when you say this, I get your point about people feeling threatened because, their social status is threatened. And here's the thing. That's what privilege is all about. We all have various privileges based on our identities and how society views them. As me, as a Black person, I grew up in Worthington, Ohio. I was able to have opportunities that some might not have, but that only happened because I had systems and structures that were able to invest in that. And I recognized some of the privileges that I had that my parents, after struggling, were eventually able to get a job and go to, my dad was able to go to Columbus State and get a degree and was able to kind of build in a pathway for me. But a lot of people don't even have some of those privileges. I recognize my privileges as, I identify as a man, and I recognize those privileges and how society treats people. And so it's for all of us to say, look, this isn't a battle or a zero-sum game between us. This is not about scarcity. It's not about saying, I've had more hardships than you've had, and so as a result, you need to worry about me. It's about recognizing that despite my hardship, despite your hardship, there are all privileges that we have that give us this opportunity to help those who are not in as a well of a position to thrive. And so that's what we need to be focusing on, because hate and racism, that is a bad thing for everybody. That hurts poor white people too. That hurts people of all backgrounds. Like, we don't need hate, we need inclusion, and it means recognizing injustice and poverty and injustice and racism.
Right. And Bobby, if I may, I kind of want to take the point that Kyle was making about privilege, especially having privilege as a Black man. I do want to ask you a quick question, Kyle, and this is something that I've encountered. When I'm talking about the oppression of Black people in America, a lot of people look at me and say, "What oppression are you talking about? Look at you, right? You're a professional. You went to college. You went to a great institution. You have a beautiful family. All that stuff. Black people clearly aren't being oppressed because I don't see oppression in you." How do you respond to those people who point to specific Black people and say, look at Oprah, look at Tyler Perry, look at all these Black celebrities, these successful, African Americans, these successful Black folk, they were able to make it, you should make it too. Clearly oppression is not a thing. How do you respond to that?
That's great. So one, I think it's a disingenuous argument that people make. I think it's misguided and doesn't have the full context of how things work in our society. Here's the thing. One is, and I get this all the time, people say, oh, you were able to go to Harvard Law School. Why does anybody, face these same situations? Why can't they just be like you? Well, here's why. Because me going to Harvard Law or being successful or having the positions that I am is not the result of my own hard work. It is also the result of systems and structures that invested in me in ways that they might not have invested in other communities. And I was able to get certain privileges and benefits along the way. And and I know you know this, JP, I still face discrimination, right? So, when I go back to my hometown of Worthington, if I catch up with old friends, I've been stopped by the police. I've been stopped by neighbors who are basically saying, you don't look familiar around here. What are you doing in this neighborhood? And I said, well, actually, I grew up in this neighborhood, so I don't know where that's coming from. It is this idea that you don't belong. It is an idea that you don't belong. And the facts are that you can't just point to people who have done great things, because for every one of us, and every one of us, there are thousands of millions of people who struggle, regardless of background, but especially based on a society rooted in anti-Blackness, a society that is also rooted in anti-poverty. We have a society that criminalizes and that is punitive to people in poverty, that is punitive to people based on how they look. And what we need to say is that, for every one of me, there are people who work 2 to 3 jobs who still can't make ends meet, who are doing everything that they can and still can't make ends meet. And this is not just a problem for Black people, but it's also a problem for white people as well. And there's this idea that, well, if you just work hard enough, you'll make the American dream, and you'll be able to make enough money, and that will be able to pass down onto your family. But for the countless stories of those who are working hard and still are struggling, it's the result of those who are at the very top, who are consolidating a lot of wealth, a lot of power, who try to point at those who are struggling and say, blame each other for your problems. Don't blame the systems that have exploited people. Blame each other for your problems. And so what I say is that I'm one person, and I'm not representative of an entire race. And you doing that and looking at me or someone successful and saying, why can't everybody just be like them? It ignores the privileges that certain people have and the benefits of certain experiences that they've had that others might not have had that same leg up in the first place.
We have a comment from the audience. The biggest scam of the American dream is the pull yourself up by your bootstraps motto, and because not everybody's bootstraps are the same length, right? And I think that that's a great segue into this idea of equitable existence. And as I've been having conversations and listening to folks, one of the things that I think about in the realm of prevention is that a foundational theory in the practice of prevention science is decreasing risk factors and increasing protective factors. We know science has proven time and again that if you increase protective factors in the lives of human beings, they will be more successful. So when we think about that concept and apply it to equity and moving toward equity, or beginning the conversation about moving toward equity, I would encourage preventionists around the state and around the world to think about it like that. What can we do? What protective factors? That's my question. What protective factors can we support to help create an equitable space for all folks?
That's great. So one, we need to invest in communities, and we need to invest in health and human services. We need to invest in healthcare. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in our neighborhoods. And here's the thing, the argument, and I see that Brittany put this out, which is fantastic, is this idea about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. The facts are that we have a society that you look at the deep inequality that we see in our society right now, of the very wealthy that own most of this nation's wealth, and while everybody else is struggling to make ends meet. And what we say is that we can give more and more tax cuts and tax breaks to those who are millionaires and billionaires, and then that money will trickle down to the rest of us, and that's how we will then thrive. And yet, at the same time, while we give those same tax cuts, we are actually cutting and gutting social services. We are cutting Medicare. We are cutting healthcare for people. We are cutting education. And so when you don't invest in those protective factors, what happens is that you have folks who are more vulnerable. And so we don't do enough to provide for those who are struggling. And here's the basic justification for that. Basically, it says, why would we reallocate or misallocate resources and funds to people who can't help themselves? That is a narrative that hurts time and time again. They say, well, why would we reallocate and misallocate resources for people who are struggling? They're not going to change. They can't help themselves. When we know that research knows, that our experience knows, that when people's basic needs are met, they can receive the support and have the opportunity to thrive when they need to. And so we have to recognize that that is built on systems of quote unquote deservingness. So we have a society that says that if you're rich, you deserve all the good that comes to you. And we have a society that says if you're poor, you deserve all of the bad that comes to you. And we need to change that and provide protective factors and saying whether you are rich or whether you are poor, you deserve dignity, you deserve security. And a part of that dignity, if you actually want to believe in freedom and equity and justice, you've got to make sure people have the freedom and the choice to even be able to cover basic needs. So you've got to be able to provide for people. And that's a critical piece that we need to focus on.
We have some great conversation happening in the chat box that I think, Kyle, part of your answer just addressed. But we have a long-standing system of providing services and receiving funding from various levels: state, local, federal. What do we need to do? Do you have any suggestions for us so that we can direct those systems and the folks in them to really fully understand and address racism? And Cynthia, thank you for your question.
That's great. So one, it's making sure that everybody recognizes that racism is a public health crisis. The facts are that that all of these issues and these compounding factors go into the social determinants of health, where you have mortality rates that are higher, you have infant mortality rates, you have all these other issues that go into the fact of centuries and decades and years, hundreds of years of discrimination have kept people from thriving. And that this isn't just discrimination that happens in the past, it's also discrimination that happens today. And here's the thing, people, they hear that and they want to disagree with it. And what I would say is this: does it really hurt you if you admit that we have a problem? Does that really hurt? And the answer is no, it doesn't. It's recognizing that I'm not going to ignore the problems that exist, and I'm actually going to do something about it. And by admitting that racism is a public health crisis, you're going to help everybody. And so what we need to do is to direct funding to communities that have been disinvested in. So it requires making an audit of where you have funded things in the past and saying, okay, could we do a better job of getting these funds to more Black-led organizations, or could we do a better job of getting these funds to more clients who have not been typically served in the past? Or of the clients or communities that we are serving, how are we interacting with these communities? Are we actually building authentic relationships with these community members, or are we just maybe providing some support but not actually building those relationships? Those are all things that we can do, is ensuring that we are investing in these communities because it's the right thing to do.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. I have another great question for you, Kyle, from our audience. It says, what is the role of community readiness in supporting racial equity? The threat of backlash in communities that aren't ready to see what's happening is very real and apparent, but we also can't continue to tell Black and Brown communities that they need to wait or continue to wait for their dignity to be recognized and their personhood protected?
That is an amazing question, and it is a question that I think people wrestle with all the time and are especially wrestling with in this moment. Here's what I would say: speak your truth. Speak boldly that you believe in these causes, in these issues, and that you believe in this dignity. And the facts are that people will give you backlash, and especially in communities that have traditionally ignored these issues. But guess what? It's up to us, especially in this moment, to stand up even boldly more than ever to speak truth to power. Because here's the thing: what we have done for too long is we've stayed silent. When these issues have come up about equity, about dignity, about security, our voices have been marginalized. And what happens is even white allies who are trying to speak up for black and brown communities in support, what they're done is they're told to stop talking about it. They're told that if you talk about race or racism, you're causing the problem. And what that does is we tend to be quiet and say, okay, well, let's not talk about it. I don't want to hurt feelings here. I don't want to get this backlash. When I think we have to recognize that that is a tactic. We can't let someone's fear and anger to address things like inclusion and their comfort. We can't have that and force us to be quiet any longer. The facts are that there has always been a backlash in American history when we've tried to move towards progress. When black people went from being enslaved to not being enslaved, people said, we shouldn't be giving people these rights. And then they were able to get more rights. And then what happened was you saw Jim Crow laws and Reconstruction era backlash of anti-black violence and the KKK and all these things are these reactionary forces that say, don't give people more rights. That their rights are infringing upon us. You have to look back and see what has happened in the history and recognize that we see this all the time. That's why you see voter suppression efforts in black and brown communities that say don't give them any special rights or more rights than us. When in fact, we're not trying to give people special rights. We're trying to talk about equal rights. This is a human rights issue. This is an equity issue, and we still have a problem here. And so, and I know Larry spoke about this just now. We talk about classism and racism that exists in this history that tries to seek us to divide. But what is really divisive? People say don't talk about race. That's divisive. What I say is it is much more divisive to not talk about race. Because what you're doing is marginalizing the experiences of so many people. And no longer is it okay to just be not racist. We have to be anti-racist. And that means if I have to confront somebody, and it's hard, but if I have to have a conversation with somebody and they say, don't talk about race, I say, well, people are still struggling. What are you doing to help these communities? Because here's the thing. Some people are more outraged by you talking about racism than they are about racism itself. People are more outraged by you talking about racism than they are about eradicating racism itself. And that speaks volumes. And so we no longer can sit back and say, I'm afraid of making you uncomfortable. Because what is far worse than that is the struggles that so many people are facing. And I'm not going to let you tell me that those struggles aren't real.
Right. And I do have there's a lot of conversation in the chat regarding the reactions that municipalities and people are having in this moment. When you're looking at the actions that the NFL is doing, for example, in making sure that the Black National Anthem is played in the first week of games and stuff along those lines, the debate about Aunt Jemima and the different symbolic things that we're trying to change. How do we make sure that the change we're trying to enact doesn't stop there? Right? How do we make sure that we actually have systematic change, that we don't settle for, okay, let's take down these statues, let's get rid of the Confederate flag, let's change these symbols. How do we make sure that it goes farther? Because my fear is people are taking this moment they're reacting to it. They're, a lot of companies are releasing these statements, right? Because it's popular to do so in the climate, and they're, changing little things here and there. And my fear is that they're just going to say, okay, well, that's enough. We dealt with the issue. How do we make sure that it goes farther than that?
So you got to have everybody on this call to speak up and say that it goes beyond symbols. And here's the thing, right? Symbols do matter. Words do matter. And so I know some people say, well, let's not focus on symbols. Let's just keep it or whatever and let that be. But the facts are that those words, those symbols do matter, and they recognize an ugly history. And it's not ignoring history by taking down statues. It's just not glorifying it. And so, those symbols do matter. And quite frankly, for those who are really, really upset about statues being taken down and symbols changing, and people are mostly upset because society is changing before their very eyes, and they see a slippery slope argument where they say, well, if these statues go down, then everything's going down. Well, that's not true. That's not true at all. And what is important is, okay, there are certain things we can agree on that needs to go, but more than that, we have to talk about larger systemic issues. We have to continue to say that taking down statues is enough. That's not the issue. And some people are going to be focused on that. And they're going to think, well, I said Black Lives Matter. I did what I needed to do. I took down statues. We're all good to go. We need to continue to say that's not enough. This is about a whole system that hurts Black people, that hurts Latinx individual, indigenous populations, and that hurts white people. The system that is as designed does not work for most people. In racism and injustice and inequality, in poverty and despair and hate, that is not the system that we should all be a part of. And some people like to see, well, let's just all come together and just not talk about these things that divide us. No, because when we choose not to talk about the things that divide us, it hurts all of us because we marginalize experiences. And so what we need to do is come together as leaders, as a community, to say that we are going to root out hate because it is the right thing to do for the future that we're building towards. And ultimately and this is what I want to do really, really quick, briefly, is for those who are kind of struggling with all of the different conversations that are happening, whether it's defund the police or whether it's statues that are coming down that they may disagree with, all these things. I want you to take a moment to say, look, it's okay to not agree with every single tactic of a particular movement or people within a movement, so long as you are on board with the overall message of rooting out injustice. And I don't want you to say, well, I'm going to avoid talking about these issues or being involved in this fight because I'm not as quote unquote radical as some other people might be. Well, I don't want you to focus on that. You need to focus on where can you in your own life and in your own community make the most impact? And then where can you maybe learn some more? I've learned within these movements, I've even realized that I need to do more to hold other people accountable. I like to work within the system and try to navigate these spaces. But what I also realize is that clearly what I've done, what we have all done, has not been enough, right? We have to do more. We have to learn more. And this is a constant process. So we're going to read more books, read more resources, and then figure out ways in which we can move towards equity. And ultimately, this is an accountability moment. There are some relationships that we're going to have to cut off. It's hard, but there are some relationships where you got to say, look, this is not an issue of like just a difference of opinion. This is a human rights issue. And if you don't believe in the dignity and value and security of all people, that's not values that I believe in or want my family to be about.
Kyle, believe it or not, we have reached the 11 o'clock hour, but I think, excuse me, because we had that little bit of a tech glitch that took about 10 minutes to recover from. If you're willing to stay with us for an extra 10 minutes, the conversation is healthy in the chat box, and we've got some great questions if you're willing to do that.
I certainly am, and I apologize again for my technical issues.
That's okay. We had one question earlier on that talked about as preventionists, we work with families a lot. And is there any guidance or support you could offer to the audience in relationship to how do we support Black parents and their mental health and the well-being as they're trying to protect their children in today's climate? And a part B to that is how do we help white parents address racism with their children?
That's great. That's such a great question. So one, there's a couple things. One, it's making sure that people have safe spaces to have these conversations, and that especially for those relationships that you've been able to build for people, making sure that they have what they need. Checking in this moment. Do you have what you need? How can we be helpful for you in this moment? And really listening to their voices and their experiences. Sometimes people just want to be heard, and they've been ignored for far too long, and we can't offer any prescriptive thing, and we say, hey, here's how you deal with your issues that you're facing, without first listening to what those issues are. And so once we kind of can hear and reach out, and obviously things are really different now because of the pandemic, and so it's much harder, but reach out and try to maybe set up a call or a conversation on Zoom to see what people need in this moment, because right now, especially where we are, we need that connection. That's why it's so sad I can't even see you guys on camera. I can see you guys, you can't see me on camera, but we need that connection because look, we are living through traumatic moments, and people need the services that they need. If they need access to counselor, they need access to quality care. Like, we need to make sure that those resources are available to them. And ultimately, we also need to look at other resources, like, how to talk about these issues. There's a lot of really great resources out there about, anti-racism resources to talk about these issues with your Black children, but then to also talk about these issues with white children and white families. There are really good books that are out there. I know Robin DiAngelo her book around white fragility is a really interesting book that I encourage a lot of folks to look into, about how to be an ally in this moment, how to talk to your family about these issues. Ibram Kendi, who just mentioned here, a lot of really good lists here that Valerie just shared about raising anti-racist children in this moment. Because here's the thing, right? Like, growing up, like, we do the behavior that we can get away with, right? And so, without accountability, people are going to continue to have hateful things and bullying, all sorts of things, and are not providing a safe space for people. And so I think what's important is for us to do is to lay out the values that we believe in, and then setting forth things that are okay and things that are not okay. So I encourage people to read those resources. Just this shared alone, some great resource. I can also send some additional resources about raising anti-racist children, but then also just talking about growing up in these moments. Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me is a great book that talks about kind of that experience of like that type of kind of father-son type of experience. Those are the types of things that people can read and look into that I think are really helpful.
Thank you for that. And if you wouldn't mind sending JP those resources, we'll use them as we continue this conversation from our perspective, and we'll share those with all of our networks. Along those same lines, we had another question from Ricky that says, as a young white male, I've actively tried to stop racism and hate in my communities, and I feel the most resistance among people who are my parents' age. What's something that I can do to help them understand the situation and end the issues or correct the issues with older generations?
That's great. That's a great question, Ricky. Thank you so much. So one of the things that I would say is that at the end of the day, you have to let folks know that things are changing, that the things that were allowed in the past, that were ignored in the past, are not going to be things that I'm going to allow in the future. And if you really believe in my future, even as if you're a young white male, if you believe in that future, you got to let them know that you believe in a future of equality, of dignity, a multiracial future of people coming together to provide safety, security, dignity for people, and say that, you know, those actions and behaviors that are pushing against racism that try to ignore racism, that diminishes my future. And if you care about me, and if you care about my community, that's the type of future that we need to build toward, a future of love, a future that's not filled with hate. And it's important for us to have those conversations because and you have to have some of those conversations sometimes at a personal level, right? I mean, not everybody is going to be able to understand it, and they're going to think, well, I know better than you, and so and so. And you need to just stand your truth, speak your truth, and say this is what you believe in, and you're going to continue to get resistance. And some people you're just never going to convince, but there are a lot of people there, regardless of generation, that are opening up to these ideas of saying that inequality and despair that we see is unacceptable. It is not okay. We can build towards a better world, and helping other people, that's not weak. That's what makes us great. We help those who are most vulnerable in our society, who are struggling, regardless of why they got there, their circumstance. And we have to talk about these issues. And talking about racism does not diminish your hardship. It does not diminish any hardships that you have. It does not make you less than what your experiences are. It just says, look, we've been talking too much. Sometimes we need to listen to other people's experiences. We will never understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And if we want to be empathetic, it means listening and trying to understand. You may not agree with everything, but there are surely things that you can listen to and try to understand your best.
Well, as we approach our new end time, I think that's a really great opportunity to say that's the action step for our audience and for our networks and for our membership is to, use empathy as our motivator and to understand that, as you said, things are changing and we have to change with them for the betterment of families, individuals, and communities across the state. Um, Kyle, I cannot thank you enough for joining us this morning. Tech difficulties and all, it's been a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate all of your insights. The chat box is going crazy now, also thanking you. Uh, and my promise on behalf of Prevention Action Alliance and JP, I think you agree wholeheartedly, is this is just the beginning of the conversation. We will continue this discussion in all of our formats, in written form, in conversation, and most importantly, in action. And we would encourage everybody else to do the same. So again, Kyle, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say one last thing for those before we sign off here. There's power in this room, and I can't, I know you can't see me, but you can see JP, you can see Bobby. There's power in this room, and even if you could see me, I can't see you, but I can see in the chat feature and all those things like that. And what I want you to know is that you have power in your voice. You have so much power, and it's hard when we look at these big issues, and sometimes it's overwhelming when we see the news, when we see people struggling, and we think there's only so much that I can do. And you're right, there is only so much you can do as one person, but you can start to have those conversations. You can have those uncomfortable conversations. Say, I may not be perfect, I may not get there overnight, but I'm trying, and that means a lot. And not only should that mean a lot to you, I want you to know that that means a lot to me, because my experiences and other people's experiences, we want people to join us in this fight. We need people to join us in this fight. And that is something that I want you to all be a part of. And so reach out to me. Let's have these conversations. And if you're struggling, you're not sure the right words or what to say, at the very least, if you are in those moments, know that you can speak your truth and lift up the stories. And that is worth fighting for. Don't let people try to belittle you or diminish you because you're trying to talk about issues that they won't talk about. You're going to shine a light on these issues, and you're going to build towards a society that believes in equity and justice for all people. So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful. JP, Bobby, thanks so much for having me.
I'm going to let that be our last word, everyone. So enjoy your weekend, continue to do the good work you do, and check back with us regularly to see how we can help you in the future. Have a great weekend, guys.
Take care.